This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 2.2, Part B, Part 2. It looks like we're going to go to 3 of these for the Republican era. And where we had left off was with the beginnings of the War of 1812. And in the beginning, the War of 1812 did not go at all well for the Americans. The Americans had kind of gotten used to fighting the Indians, who were technologically inferior. And as a result, they'd grown into a kind of a very... they developed very bad habits. They were not an experienced army, at least not against a competent military force like Great Britain. They lacked experience. Any of the officer corps that had served in the Revolution that had experience against the British was now all gone. This is 30 years after the Revolution, so they're all now gone. One of the things that the Federalists neglected in their brief time in the sun was to develop a hardcore national army. Their feeling was that they didn't really need to, was one, because all they're fighting is the Indians, and two, they didn't really have the money to do it. They were already in debt and trying to scramble for ways to get rid of that debt. And we talked about that during the Federalist during the discussion of the Federalists. So there really wasn't a professional trained army available. And this gets coupled with the fact that, as I've mentioned before, the Indians of the American Northwest, okay, and by Northwest, again, I reiterate this all the time because it's one of these funny things. You know, you think of the Northwest now and you think of Oregon. We're talking Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, that area. Had been playing the British off against the Americans, and early on in the conflict, they, of course, will side with the British as their best way to prevent continued American expansion into their territory, and so they'll forge an alliance with the British and prove pivotal. And in the early days of the war, the Americans are going to suffer a series of reversals, which they themselves, the turning point, and we'll talk about this, is going to be the Battle of Erie, which gains the United States some momentum, which is rapidly lost because of the events of 1814, which we'll get to. After 1814 is Napoleon's final defeat in Russia, when he brings the Grand Army limping back into Paris. Of the 650,000 men that Napoleon invades Russia with, less than 50,000 of them make it back to France. The remainder dying either as battlefield casualties, the majority of them dying from exposure, malnutrition, and disease. But at any rate, that means that Britain is no longer pinned down, and then they'll launch the very famous Chesapeake Offensive, in which they burn Washington, D.C., and we'll get to that. As I just mentioned, the early campaigns of the war witness a series of reversals from the Americans, who are ill-prepared to face a professional, well-trained European army. In the Northwest, in the area of Detroit, Michigan, what is now Detroit, Michigan, and what was then Detroit, Michigan, they'll lose Detroit and Fort Dearborn. Fort Dearborn is the key American frontier fortress guarding the very northwest point of what was then the United States. It lies really at the westernmost extreme of Lake Erie. The second problem that the Americans have is they suffer from a kind of a miscalculation, very similar to the miscalculation that the British made when they commenced their southern campaign in the Revolution. The Americans believed that like themselves, the Canadians were objecting to the continuation of British rule. And as a result of this, when the Americans launched an offensive into Canada to try to wrest control of British Canada from the Brits, the Canadians would kind of rise up in rebellion against Britain and join the American side. This, of course, never takes place. And in point of fact, the Canadians remained loyal to the British and remained loyal British subjects, and ultimately they will get their independence through a negotiated treaty in 1867 under John Macdonald, which to me, just as an aside, and I love the Canadians. I used to have a girlfriend that was Canadian. Love the Canadians. Canadians are great people. Canadians are our neighbors to the north, right? But it really differentiates the Canadians from the United States, because the United States fought a revolution by force of arms, okay, to gain their independence from Britain. The Canadians in 1867 were just kind of given their independence on the proviso that they stay part of the British Commonwealth. In other words, the British finally said, you know what, we're a little bit tired of you guys sitting around here anyways, and we're certainly tired of trying to maintain any kind of presence here, so why don't you guys just go and form your own country? And that's it's always, I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know. It just tells me that that's why the Canadians have a tendency to be a lot more passive than the Americans. But at any rate, and another of the problems with the Americans, and I kind of mentioned this before, is that the United States doesn't have really a professional, disciplined, trained army. They rely instead on a collection of militias. There is a lingering, even after the Federalists, there's still a lingering suspicion of a standing army. Partially due to the experience they had with the British standing army in America, which probably culminated, I suppose, most famously in the Boston Massacre that we talked about. And so what the Americans rely on early in the war, anyways, is militias, loosely coordinated, rapidly put together state militias. And under the charters of most states, the orders of the militia, okay, the conditions of the militia were such that they were not compelled, it was not compulsory for them to cross state lines. Okay, they had to do this on a voluntary basis. And so when the invasion of Canada comes up, a lot of the militias, particularly in New York, just simply refuse to cross the border. They see themselves, militias are a little bit different. And this is the problem overall in the war. What the Americans are attempting to accomplish, this is not a defensive war for the Americans. What the Americans are trying to accomplish is offensive. It's expansionistic. It's the conquest of Canada and booting the British out of the northwestern part of what is the United States. And so it's an offensive campaign. The state militias don't see themselves as having an offensive function. They see themselves as having a defensive function. Okay? And so as a result of that, when they're asked to go into Canada, when they're asked to go into British territory, they simply refuse to do so. And the final thing is, you really don't have any more than you did in the Revolution, really, which explains a lot of the American reversals early in the Revolution. You don't have experienced, bloodied commanders. Okay, none of the guys in 1812, none of these guys has actually seen action against a professional army. The most notable of them are William Henry Harrison, who we talked about. William Henry Harrison was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, where they defeated Tecumseh and the Indians in the Northwest, and Andrew Jackson, who's been fighting Indian wars in Tennessee. This is the first time we're going to see Andrew Jackson come on the historical stage, and then, of course, we'll talk about him when he becomes president. And so you have an inferior command structure. And so the Americans really, in the early part, get the hell beat out of them early on. Now that position of the Americans getting the hell beat out of them early on is going to reverse itself because of truly one of the most imaginative, audacious, and ambitious offensives. Something that becomes typical of the United States and Americans. It's reminiscent of the bold, unbelievable attempt by Arnold and Hale, or Arnold and Montgomery, to move into Canada early in the Revolution, if you can remember that. It's an audacious, ambitious plan. The Americans don't have a chance because of the inferiority of their forces and their command structure, and they're trying to rally all of this together. They just simply don't have a chance to launch a land campaign in the Northwest that would drive the British back out of their positions in Ohio and Michigan and retake Fort Dearborn and set up a base of operations, presumably then perhaps even to go into Canada. And so between William Henry Harrison and Admiral Oliver Perry, they come up with an absolutely inane, bold, ambitious, no way it can work plan. The plan is to assemble the American fleet on Lake Erie and seek a tactical advantage where they can achieve a decisive victory against the British fleet on Lake Erie. Once in command of Lake Erie, the Americans could then launch an amphibious assault, bypassing the British forces in northern Ohio, and retake Fort Dearborn before the British really knew what hit them. It's a bold idea. It's predicated on the idea, however, that Perry is going to be able to beat the British fleet in Lake Erie. Well, in one of several examples during the War of 1812, two very famous ones, the Americans are going to get lucky. They're going to take advantage of some blind, stinking luck. And if you look at the battle animation here, which comes to us from History Animated again, and I decided not to put the map up here this time because I just want to talk about it briefly. The British fleet was to the north of the American fleet on Lake Erie, and the wind at that time was going from Canada in a southeasterly direction. So it was against the Americans. So the Americans, because of the wind, the Americans were not going to be able to close on the British fleet and engage them. Okay? And as long as the British fleet stays on Lake Erie, they can't launch an amphibious assault. And so Perry's really kind of screwed here, and that lasts for a couple of days. And then all of a sudden, the wind shifts. It shifts 180 degrees. And instead of blowing from northwest to southeast, the wind shifts and starts blowing from southeast to northwest. The American fleet is then able to rapidly close on the British fleet before it can escape. The American ships being generally smaller and faster, they close on the British fleet very quickly and encircle it and pound it to ribbons. Okay? And so the British fleet is defeated. The few remaining ships are forced to surrender, which gives the Americans naval superiority on Lake Erie, okay, which allows them then to launch an amphibious assault, which will be under the command of William Henry Harrison, which will surprise the British at Fort Dearborn and recapture it for the Americans, ending the initial period of the war. That ends really the first part of the war in the West. In terms of the British offensive, the British will then rapidly try to withdraw all of their troops back to defend Canada. The Eastern Theater doesn't go as well for the Americans. Okay, it again in the early part of the war, the Americans suffer some significant reversals. The first problem that we identify here with this PowerPoint, the first point we make, is the U.S. financial situation. Now let's back up here a minute. In 1791, the United States charters its first national bank, which is the reason really for the division between Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. What the first national bank is going to do is give the national government control over the monetary system of the United States and allow them to control the supply of money. This was done, if you'll recall. We go back and we kind of recap and we review these things, right? We go back and remember in the 1780s, after the Revolution, the United States had runaway inflation. Everybody was producing money. Banks were lending out way too much money. The currency, the paper currency, wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. We had this debtor-creditor problem that almost erupted into a civil war. It ended up culminating in Shays' Rebellion. It was a great controversy. So Hamilton puts in this national bank that centralizes control of money. And during the 1790s, they gradually rein in the supply of money, which brings the inflation down, stabilizes the economy, everything, okay, gets going well. Well, the First National Bank was chartered for 20 years. It wasn't designed to be a permanent institution. And so in 1811, its charter runs out. And when its charter runs out, now let's remember this. While I've said that one of the things that's characteristic of the Republican era and the Republican administration is they came into office claiming to be the party of limited national government. Okay, they wanted they advocated states' rights, they advocated individual liberty, they advocated a limited national government. But then what did we see? We saw Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase and the Embargo Act increase not only the power of the national government, but the power of the presidency, etc. Well, in 1809, James Madison takes over. James Madison is more a true Republican. Okay, he had a falling out with Hamilton. He originally started as a Federalist. He was the one that authored the Bill of Rights. So he still philosophically holds to the Republican ideal of limited national government. So when in 1811 the First National Bank's charter runs out, Madison will not advocate renewing the charter. And so from 1811 onwards, and we'll deal with this again in 1816, but from 1811 onwards, there is no national bank. And so the same situation that happened during the Revolutionary War is going to begin to happen again. And the War of 1812 is going to exacerbate that. You're going to have banks lending out too much money. You're going to have states printing money. You're going to have way an excess of the supply of money again, and therefore you're going to have inflation. And during the War of 1812, okay, financing the war and the costs of the war is going to push the United States very close to bankruptcy, because they're trying to borrow more and more money to fight the war, but their credit system, their financial system, their money is losing value rapidly. And so nobody wants to lend them money. To put it shortly, okay, nobody wants to, the United States is having trouble financing the war because they're borrowing money to finance the war. Well, no one wants to lend them money. The reason nobody wants to lend them money is they fear a situation like after the Revolutionary War. If the United States continues to flood the system with money so that the currency loses its value because there's so much of it, as it had during the Revolution, when the time comes to pay all these loans back after the war, the money that they're paying it back with is going to be worthless. And so nobody really wants to lend the money. And so the United States, by 1814, is teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. Just at the time, and now we hit 1814. Okay? As I mentioned, in 1814, Napoleon's defeat in Russia comes to full fruition. Okay? And he limps the army back to France. This frees Britain up. They're no longer pinned down by the Napoleonic conflicts, so they're now free to devote their resources to the North American theater and maintaining their control of Canada and attempting to accomplish what they never accomplished in the Revolution, which is defeating the United States. Now, they don't envision, there's one point that's kind of a little bit anyways important to point out here, which is that they don't envision reconquering the United States and bringing it back into the British Empire. At least that's not the official policy. They just want to hold on to Canada and their position in the Northwest. Well, now they're not pinned down with the Napoleonic conflicts. They can devote greater resources there, and by the summer of 1814, they're present. They will use these resources to launch a twin operation. One is to march south out of Canada on Lake Champlain and try to, once again, as they did in the Saratoga campaign in the Revolution, try to cut off New England from the remainder of the colonies. Okay? Very reminiscent of Burgoyne's Champlain campaign, with, it should be noted, very similar results. They will again underestimate the terrain. They will underestimate American resolve. This time, the New York militias that had refused to go into Canada will, in fact, stand a post, because now they're in a defensive position, so they're willing to stand a post, and they'll defeat the British and force them back into Canada. Such is not the case in Maryland. They will launch an amphibious assault in Maryland that has as its objective a two-pronged offensive. The first part of it will be to seize Washington, D.C., which at that point has been made the American capital, and the other is to land north of Baltimore, then take both these armies and conquer Baltimore, thereby controlling the Chesapeake region. Okay? And then, presumably what they wanted to do with that was then use that as a negotiating position to exchange that back to the United States in exchange for American recognition of the British control of Canada and the Northwest. Okay? And at the Battle of Bladensburg, Washington, D.C. will be sacked, and it will be burned. James Madison and Dolly Madison, his wife, the First Lady, will both get on horseback and evacuate the city. Now, Madison doesn't quite. I don't want to characterize it that way. Madison doesn't quite just turn tail and run. Okay, he oversees a very orderly, well-disciplined evacuation of Washington, D.C., and in point of fact, he's really kind of the last man out of the city. He makes sure that everything else is out. By that point, they've started to burn the city, particularly the White House. This is when the White House gets burned. And I mentioned earlier the kind of stroke of luck that Oliver Perry took advantage of in the Battle of Erie. This is going to be the second stroke of luck, only this one's a little bit different because this one's much more major. This is actually what's going to lead in many ways, at least in my mind. Okay, it's one of those things that there's not consensual agreement, but I think that this is one of the reasons what's going to happen here in D.C. is one of the reasons that the Americans will become convinced of the idea of manifest destiny, which will play out in full a little bit later. But the Americans at this point become convinced. Well, let me just explain what happens. Okay, in the middle of the D.C. fire, as the British are rallying their forces together to march north towards Baltimore and link up with their other force, which is going to launch an amphibious campaign. Okay, the Battle of Baltimore Harbor is just about to rage. Okay, which is where Francis Scott Key very famously gets captured, and on board a British warship that is besieging Baltimore, he'll write the Star-Spangled Banner. Okay, which is why the Star-Spangled Banner is such a military song. You know, it's the only national anthem that the Star-Spangled Banner is the only national anthem on the planet that mentions warfare. Which I suppose should be somewhat telling of the United States. But at any rate, I don't want to digress too much to that. But so the British are rallying their army in D.C. to march north, when all of a sudden, the worst storm in 100 years hits Washington, D.C. in the middle of the summer. It pours down torrential rain. This is the residual of a hurricane that had blown through. It pours down torrential rain, extinguishing the fire. As the British Army is marching north towards Baltimore, so severe is this storm, you're talking winds of 75, 80 miles an hour, with driving rain, that it will destroy a third of the British Army. It will completely disperse the rest of them. Okay, they'll break ranks. The British Army, literally, as a result of this storm, disintegrates. Which the Americans now become convinced of the fact that God is on their side. God made this storm to destroy the British Army. And so from that point forward, the Americans, really from that point until this point, some of you, if you study American national government, something like that, you'll hear something that they refer to as American exceptionalism. This is the basis of American exceptionalism. That and there are people, listen to this, I was in graduate school, a serious undertaking. We're students, we're scholars, we're studying, where one of my colleagues, one of the other students, literally, his argument was based on the idea that he believed that Americans, the United States citizens, were a combination of human beings and angels, that they were one step closer to God than any other human beings. And this is the basis of American exceptionalism, that Americans have this special place in the eyes of God. Well, look at this. In the midst of the American disaster, the midst of the British offensive in the Chesapeake, a storm emerges from out of nowhere and destroys the British Army. I mean, that's higher power stuff right there. That's supernatural. All right, or at least that's what the Americans believe. The British also will fail in their landing of Baltimore Harbor and will abandon the undertaking. When this happens, they abandon the undertaking, because what we also have to remember is while the British Army is being destroyed on their march north because of this storm, the British fleet is being buffeted by this storm. Okay, so the British will ultimately withdraw. And that will largely be the end of the war. It won't be the final end of the war. But at that point, negotiations begin. Okay? And the negotiations will be encapsulated in the Treaty of Ghent. Now, the Treaty of Ghent is negotiated in the fall of 1814. It will be signed the day before Christmas in 1814, and it restores antebellum conditions. In other words, there are no territorial acquisitions whatsoever. There are no agreements to repay debts. There are no agreements for reparations. Antebellum conditions means that it returns the condition to what it was before the war. Okay? It's as though the war never took place. However, at the time that this is negotiated, the British are launching an offensive, an amphibious assault, in an attempt to deprive the United States of the port of New Orleans. Okay? So they're gonna invade southern Louisiana to drive the Americans out of the port of New Orleans and cut that off as a trade route. Okay? And this will be when Andrew Jackson makes his name. Andrew Jackson, the famous Indian fighter, has never really fought a European-style battle. And if you go to, I don't have it listed here, but if you go to thehistoryanimated.com and click on the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans is one of these. It's an extraordinarily impressive battle. I probably should have put it up here and talked about it in detail, but we have a lot of other fish to fry. But Jackson's defense of New Orleans is brilliant. The British make a series of mistakes, again underestimating the terrain. That's to be sure. Jackson has an army of about 4,000 men. He's joined by Jean Lafitte and pirates, okay, literally pirates, cutthroats, okay, who join his army as volunteers, as soldiers of fortune. The British land to the east of New Orleans. They land, and I don't know if any of you have ever been to New Orleans or to southern Louisiana, but southern Louisiana is a wetland. It's a miserable place. It is all swamp. All around the city of New Orleans is swampland. So the British land their force in the middle of a swamp, which means that it takes them forever and a day to march on New Orleans. This gives Jackson plenty of time to prepare defenses. So he's from a very well-prepared defensive position. Now, the British outnumber him in this campaign by about 5 to 1. Okay? So he's hard-pressed. He's up against it. But Jackson, in an another typically American bold move, will take a handful of his forces, march into the Louisiana Bayou, and engage the British by surprise, okay? Which doesn't really do any damage to the British. It's a drawn battle. It's not decisive at all, but it makes the British very cautious. They now are convinced that they're up against an American commander who, yes, is competent enough, but who is crazy as a shithouse goose. Okay, excuse my language. He's a nutball to have done this. Okay, so they're a little cautious when it comes to Andrew Jackson. They know they're not dealing with George Washington. They're dealing with an American who is bold, who is cutthroat, and who is not screwing around. So they approach New Orleans very cautiously. And while they cautiously approach New Orleans from the bayou, Jackson rallies his forces and builds a defensive frontier. Earthworks, okay, literally a trench line, and a mountain, okay, a parapet, on which he will mount artillery, and Jean Lafitte, his contribution to the battle is he brings about 400 experienced artillerymen that will handle Jackson's batteries, most notable of which is a 32-pound gun. And so when the British move forward to try to take the American position, they just get absolutely pulverized by the experienced artillerymen of Lafitte, and it decimates, it destroys, it nearly annihilates the British army. But by the time they get to the actual American defenses, it's all over but the shouting. And this is where, I don't know if you've ever heard this is where the famous saying attributed to Andrew Jackson correctly, this is where it comes from, the Battle of New Orleans. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Because, among other things, not only was Jackson short of men, he was short of material and supplies. They didn't have much ammunition. Okay? And so he needed to conserve that, and so he said, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. Until they're right up upon you. And then let them have it. which he did, and won an absolutely astounding victory, killing the British at about a 7-to-1 ratio. And it was the end of the war. Now, the fact is that the war was actually officially over when this campaign took place. And the Battle of New Orleans really rages from the end of December, about 3 days after the Louisiana campaign itself, from about 3 days after the Treaty of Ghent until the 8th and the final defeat of the British at New Orleans. So anyways, the war is now over. And in kind of not, I don't know that I would say the middle, towards the end of it, right around the Treaty of Ghent, as the war is winding down, the New England states are going to convene the Hartford Convention. And the Hartford Convention will really be symbolic more than anything else. But this will be the final rally of the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party has been dying out gradually since it lost the White House, since it lost control of the government in 1800, but they're still a viable political force all the way up into 1814. This will be the end of that. They convene the Hartford Convention, which proposes a series of amendments to the Constitution. Now, we want to put this in context and remember as we go into this that the Federalists, from the very get-go, from the 1790s onwards, the Federalists, they were always leaning towards a favorable position, let's say, okay, a favorable position towards Great Britain. It was the Republicans and this anti-federalist movement that favored association with France that ultimately culminated in the Franco-American Accord. Well, as a result of this, as you can imagine, and as we talked about at the beginning of the War of 1812, the House of Representatives and the Senate were divided on support for the war. Well, the opposition to the War of 1812 and to the declaration of the War of 1812 and to going to war with Britain really came from the Federalists, the old holdover of the Federalist Party. Okay? They get voted down. The war gets supported. Congress declares war. And so they walk away, like little children who don't get their way. And they steam and they rage and they pound their fists and they stomp their feet and they whine and they cry. And eventually, as December of 14 wears on, and so it's really a horrible thing. But it's actually true, and the Hartford Convention really does kind of epitomize it. In the early days of the war, as I said, the Americans were getting the hell beat out of them by the British. The Federalists were loving that. Okay? The New England militias all refused to take part in the war. They were loving the fact that they were getting beaten. What they were doing, they were doing it. I told you so. I told you so. I told you shouldn't have gone to war with these people. You have no chance of winning. See, we told you shouldn't have gone to war. If only you'd listened to us. Well, now December of 14 comes up. Remember, it's in the summer and fall of 14 that the British launched their Chesapeake offensive and burn Washington, D.C. The Federalists take this as a clear indication that those who favored war with Britain were wrong. They were idiots. And so they convened the Hartford Convention to try to prevent anything like this from happening again. And so, among other things, they move to end the 3/5 clause regarding slaves for representation that was in the Great Compromise that we talked about. Well, why would they do this? Go back a few slides and look at the vote supporting the War of 1812 in the House of Representatives. A lot of those representatives, now the House of Representatives is proportionally based on population. Well, a lot of those representatives have their seat in the House because of the population of the South. They come from the southern states. The only reason they're sitting there is because the southern states' slave population counts as 3/5. A lot of those guys wouldn't be in the House of Representatives if you didn't count slaves, and if they hadn't been in the House of Representatives, the War of 1812 maybe never would have happened. Another thing, 2/3 majority to admit new states. Okay, this will prevent additional states from being added, particularly in the southern region. Okay, you need a 2/3 majority for a declaration of war. a two-thirds majority for trade treaties. This is what they're proposing. Now, if you needed that two-thirds majority, the War of 1812 never would have happened. It wouldn't have been declared. Okay? And, okay, fine. And they're gaining some support for this idea. They're preparing to push this as constitutional amendments. And the threat is, the implicit threat, which will ultimately be an explicit threat, is that if they don't get this, they'll secede from the Union and form their own country. And it's moving with great momentum. The Federalists are now, again, a very potent political force at this point. They're really pushing for this. And then the Battle of New Orleans happens. Jackson's overwhelming, decisive victory, more decisive than any battle with the possible exception of Hanna's Cowpens in the Revolution, okay, just completely discredits all of those who argued against the war. Okay, now it's the Republicans' turn to say, we told you so. We told you we could kick these guys' asses, and we did. And so it completely takes the wind out of the momentum, out of the sails of the Federalists as they're pushing for this Hartford Convention. It completely discredits the party. Okay, so ultimately the ultimate fate of the Federalists is decided on the field of battle. When Jackson wins that battle and overwhelmingly defeats the British, it's the end of the Federalists as a viable political force. They will never be heard from again. Their vestiges, their real core, that last bit, that last kind of burning ember of the Federalist Party, will ultimately try to amplify itself into what become known as the National Republicans, backing Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. We'll get to that later on when we see the rise of the Democrats. Actually, at the very end of the discussion of the Republicans. But that's okay. Now, with the American victory against the British, we have now that introduces, really beginning in 1815 and 1816, what's known as the era of good feelings. Okay, let's line up what's happened here. Andrew Jackson, with an American force, unlike the victory at Yorktown where the French were involved, Andrew Jackson, with an American force of volunteers, has overwhelmingly defeated a much larger British force. The Americans, while the War of 1812 was officially a draw and returned to antebellum conditions, the Americans have a lot to be proud of here at the end of the war. It was an act of divine providence that drove the British out of the Chesapeake. Okay? It was an act of military genius on Jackson's part that drove the offensive out of New Orleans. And so the Americans are feeling pretty good about themselves. This creates a feeling of American nationalism that there never had actually been before. The Federalists tried to create it, but Americans really identified themselves more with their state than with the United States. That's going to change during the era of good feelings. People are now going to start to see themselves as Americans. Okay? This is going to allow for a massive expansion in the power of the national government, which actually is going to culminate, probably the largest point of that, is going to be a Supreme Court decision in McCulloch v. Maryland. And this will create, now Britain is no longer a viable force in the Northwest. Okay, so now there is nothing but the native populations to prevent the United States from spreading across west of the Mississippi through the Louisiana Territory, which they will begin to do immediately. Okay, and that's, I mentioned earlier, this idea right here of American exceptionalism. Okay, this is the basis of Manifest Destiny. The Americans, and then and now, Americans still suffer from this idea. Okay, that the United States has a unique position under God, that it is God's kind of chosen republic. And therefore, what Manifest Destiny and American exceptionalism are going to be based on is the idea that the United States has a divine destiny to conquer all of North America because they are superior, They are morally superior. They are ethically superior. They are just superior human beings, and therefore they should be allowed to dominate. The weird thing of this is, and just kind of at the end of this particular part of the lecture, when I teach American foreign policy, this is one of the things we get into. And it's really something that's absolutely bizarre to American foreign policy makers in terms of the formulation and implementation of American foreign policy. The United States and United States foreign policy still operates under these conditions. Okay? It ultimately gets to something that's well beyond our scope here. Now, we talk about it in U.S. history too a little bit, called nation building. The United States foreign policy apparatus honestly believes that everybody on the planet wants to be like the United States, because after all, objectively speaking, the United States is superior. So what the United States seeks to do is create little carbon copies of itself everywhere it goes. One of the early applications of this was the Vietnam conflict. The Vietnam conflict was based on the idea of nation building. The invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, nation building. The United States is going to build up these stable democracies that look like Western-style liberal democracies. This all comes from this American exceptionalism idea. Okay? In addition, we see, and this is what we just mentioned, during this period of the era of good feelings, during this very nationalistic period, we see an expansion of the national government's power. We see a new national bank chartered in 1816 to try to rein in the supply of money. As I mentioned, during the War of 1812, inflation ratcheted up again. We're going to charter a new national bank in 1816 for another 20 years to give the government control over the supply of money. The southern states, which had great hope when the Republicans took over, particularly with Madison, very much hoped that that era of protectionism that the Federalists had come into would be gone, and the Republicans would favor free trade, that they'd allow the states to conduct their own trade policy without the interference of the national government. This, of course, will be dashed immediately during this period. Okay, they will introduce new tariffs during the era of good feelings of between 20 and 25%, which is a higher tariff than they've ever had. Okay, we don't count the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act or Macon's Bill as tariff treaties because they didn't involve tariffs and taxes on foreign imports. These do. Okay. Furthermore, they're going to placate the reason, and that's kind of what I want to get at here. What we mean by this is the reason that they introduce these tariffs, the reason that they introduce all of this, is to placate this secessionist movement in the New England. Okay, what they're really doing is they're selling out the southern states and they're adopting a protectionist policy, even though it runs against their ideals as Republicans who favor limited government. They're going to do this to pander to New England, to keep New England on board in the Union. In addition, we see the first episode, okay, the first instance of what ultimately will become known as the American system, which never really comes online actually until the 1930s. It's a subsidization scheme. Okay, it's ultimately going to be the brainchild of Henry Clay. Henry Clay is the one that's going to mostly push for this, which we'll see later on. Okay, the revenue taken from the tariffs, from these 20 to 25% tariffs, will be used to subsidize American manufacturing. That comes as wonderful news to the New England manufacturing class, okay, to this new bourgeois class of manufacturers in the North. It doesn't, sound as good to the southern states. The revenue from the tariff will also be used to finance infrastructure development. The Erie Canal will be built and completed during this period. Okay, and we'll deal with that when we go through the transportation revolution later on. Most of that infrastructure development is going to take place in the North because, again, they're placating the northern states. It's the northern states at this point that are threatening to secede. Now, in this original proposition to subsidize all of this, Madison will exercise his veto as president. This is 1816. Madison is just on his way out of office. Madison will leave office and turn it over to James Monroe. Madison will veto this, as rightly he should. Madison is the Republican. He still believes in limited national government. And that's one of the things we like about James Madison, or I like about James Madison, is unlike Jefferson. Jefferson espouses all these limited national government Republican ideals, okay, individual liberty. Then he gets into office and expands the power of the national government and the power of the presidency. Madison doesn't do that. Madison wrote the Bill of Rights. He stays true to his principles. Yes, he supports the tariffs, but, it's politically expedient to do so to keep the North online. But when it comes to this idea, he exercises a veto because he says in the U.S. Constitution, and it is true that in the U.S. Constitution there is nothing that even remotely suggests that the American national government, the U.S. national government, should be involved in any way, shape, or form in the economy, particularly in subsidizing the economy or stimulating the economy. And so he holds to this principle and vetoes this. And I can see by the clock on the wall that we're out of time for this lecture. And so we'll pick it up right where we left off with the development of James Monroe and, most importantly, the Missouri Compromise and things like that. And so, as I suspected, this Republican era, we have 2 weeks on this Republican thing, and this is going to divide itself into 3 lectures.